Big news has been unfolding across the United Kingdom, and for drivers over the age of 65 this development could hit closer to home than many might expect, because for decades renewing a license as an older motorist has been a routine process, something handled with little more than a form, a declaration of health, and an automatic approval that allowed people to continue driving. But now new proposals are being actively considered that could transform this long-standing system and dramatically change the way older drivers are tested, monitored, and ultimately permitted to remain behind the wheel. And although no final decision has been announced, the seriousness of these conversations has created widespread anxiety and debate as pensioners, campaigners, families, and policymakers grapple with the question of whether these changes represent a genuine step toward road safety or an unfair penalty for those who have simply reached a certain age. Imagine being a driver who has been on the road for 40 or 50 years, who knows the lanes of the local village and the motorways of the region as well as the furniture in their own home, who has never received a single penalty point, never been caught speeding, never caused an accident, and who has always completed license renewals with ease, yet now being told that new regulations may require stricter medical checks, mandatory eyesight assessments, or even practical driving tests repeated every few years, a prospect that feels less like a precaution and more like a punishment. And that feeling of injustice is precisely why this debate has become so heated. Officials at the Department for Transport have suggested that tougher standards are needed, citing concerns about the health, vision, and reflexes of elderly motorists, but campaigners counter that age alone does not determine ability and that blanket rules risk unfairly targeting older people who rely on cars not merely for convenience but for independence, particularly in rural areas where public transport is sparse and unreliable. Meaning the car is not just a vehicle but a lifeline that allows access to shops, medical services, social visits, and the wider community. If the rules change, many fear that licenses for those over 65 could truly be at risk and that capable drivers might find themselves sidelined simply because of their birth date, raising difficult questions about equality, dignity, and safety in modern Britain. At present, the rules already separate older motorists from younger ones. As once a driver turns 70, their license must be renewed every 3 years rather than once a decade, a process that sounds straightforward but involves declaring medical conditions and confirming overall health, something easy for those in good condition but potentially complicated for those with illnesses such as diabetes, glaucoma, heart disease, or limited mobility, since additional medical documentation may be required and sometimes licenses are even suspended until the DVLA receives satisfactory evidence. When considering the bigger picture, it is vital to recognize the sheer scale of senior drivers in the UK. Millions of motorists are over 65, with more than 5 million already beyond 70, a number set to climb rapidly as people live longer and remain active well into later life, which means these debates do not concern a small minority but a large and growing segment of society. The stakes are high because driving is not merely a way of getting from one place to another. For many older people, it is central to maintaining independence, dignity, and a sense of control over daily life, and the potential removal of that privilege feels like a profound threat. Critics of older drivers argue that age inevitably brings slower reaction times, poorer eyesight, and a higher risk of sudden medical episodes, while others emphasize that elderly motorists are often among the safest on the roads, less likely to speed, less likely to take reckless chances, and generally more considerate, with accident statistics revealing that younger drivers, particularly those under 25, are far more likely to be involved in high-risk crashes, although when older drivers are involved in accidents, the outcomes can be more severe due to physical vulnerability rather than recklessness. This leads to the pressing question of whether the proposals now under discussion are truly about addressing road safety or whether they verge on discrimination against a group that has been driving responsibly for decades. The timing of these debates stems partly from the reality of an aging population, with life expectancy climbing and more people than ever before driving into their 70s, 80s, and even 90s, a trend far less common a generation or two ago. Each time an accident involving an older motorist makes national headlines, especially if the results are tragic, calls for tougher restrictions resurface, and medical professionals reinforce the concern by noting that conditions such as dementia, glaucoma, and slower reflexes may impair driving in subtle ways not always recognized by the driver. Road safety advocates insist that if introducing stricter testing saves even a few lives, the measures are worth pursuing, but on the other side, advocacy groups, pensioners, and sympathetic politicians argue that such blanket policies amount to age discrimination and fail to recognize the careful habits of many senior drivers who pride themselves on adherence to rules, politeness on the road, and decades of safe experience. Proposals currently floated include practical assessments every 3 to 5 years after a certain age, cognitive testing to measure memory and concentration, and more frequent medical reviews requiring the involvement of GPs. Yet each of these raises practical and ethical issues since assessments may be stressful for those who have not taken a test in 50 years, medical reviews may burden an already overstretched NHS, and cognitive tests may unfairly penalize those who happen to perform poorly on a single day despite being competent most of the time. Alternatives have been suggested, such as voluntary refresher courses aimed at boosting confidence and updating knowledge, or the increasing reliance on advanced vehicle technologies like automatic braking, lane keeping assistance, and collision detection, which may help offset natural age-related decline. Adaptations like modified controls and enhanced vision aids could also extend safe driving years for those with specific conditions. Whatever measures are chosen, the consequences for seniors could be profound, because while stricter checks might reassure families and reduce certain risks, they may also impose heavy financial and emotional burdens on pensioners already coping with rising living costs. Imagine being 75, after decades of flawless driving, suddenly forced to pay for repeated assessments or risk losing your license. For many, this would not only feel unfair but also threaten their independence. In rural areas where buses and trains are scarce, a car is often the only link to the outside world, and losing it could bring isolation, loneliness, and reduced quality of life, potentially creating more demand on the NHS and social serve. Opinion is sharply divided. Some younger drivers, frustrated by what they perceive as slower reactions among elderly motorists, support tougher restrictions, while others defend their parents and grandparents, arguing that age does not equal incompetence. Online forums reveal anger, fear, and resignation among seniors, some of whom accept that change is inevitable while others vow to resist what they see as discriminatory rules. The government, meanwhile, must navigate carefully, balancing safety with fairness, independence with precaution. Any major reform would involve consultation, debate in Parliament, and likely a phased rollout, perhaps beginning with voluntary programs before mandatory ones, but with discussions gaining momentum. Announcements could arrive sooner than expected. Ultimately, the issue is not just about licenses, forms, or policies. It is about people, freedom, and dignity in later life, about the kind of society Britain wants to build, one that respects independence across generations while ensuring safety for all road users. The question remains how to strike that balance without stripping capable drivers of their rights, and that is why this story resonates so deeply, sparking passionate arguments at kitchen tables, in community halls, and online forums across the nation, because behind every statistic is a real person, a neighbor, a parent, or a grandparent who simply wants to keep living life on their own terms.